Hi, everybody. We're Breaking Point Solutions, and this is your second presentation. A lot of you have not seen the presentation. Glenn will take the screen share and walk you through the study that has been completed for Columbia.
Thank you.
All right, and also we have a list of questions that are based off the first presentation that I'll try to remember to get to. All right, so what I'm going to assume, of course, is that everybody here is a rocket scientist and a network engineer, so you'll understand everything I say on the first try, which is very unlikely. But what we have here is we've created a URL for your county. We gave you access to that, or at least some of you got access to that. Jenny definitely got it. And there's an access code that will get you into it. And what this is our version of a 3-pound 3-ring binder report. Unfortunately, we don't believe in paper. We love trees. So we've made it all digital instead. The content here basically is several parts. Anytime you see a bold underline title section here, when you click on that, it's going to either open another web page or it's going to download a report. So the content that you see here is fully accessible once Jeannie passes out the access codes. And the idea here is that you can use the information to both critique what we've done, use what we've done, or apply it in terms of any discussions you have with potential partner ISPs, your dear friends at NOAANET, the Port Authority, or anybody else is going to help you get broadband services into the community. So there are a couple of minor proprietary elements in here having to do with spreadsheet content, but you can't really get in there to figure out what they are. So that's pretty much okay too. The idea is that we're trying to give you as much information as we can from the wilds of Minnesota about your specific county. And there's a lot of information that we have available and we're able to derive from folks who actually do work inside your county. Now, the first document that you can click on is called the project overview document. When you click on that, it downloads a Word document. And when you open that document, what you'll basically see is that this is a guide as to how we do these kinds of studies and what is on the website and how to interpret the content. So it's kind of like your handbook to where the data came from, how we do our calculations, what types of information is contained under different sections of the mapping that we provide to you, how to interpret that information. It's a great reading material. We have some of in the network modeling, we look at some multiple path solutions and how to get that to look in a similar kind of, basically it's a handbook, okay? How to interpret what you're seeing on the website. Now, the first thing that we look at when we're looking at any particular area is we need to know where the existing fiber resources are. And that's the public domain known fiber. That opens up a map. And based on the information we were able to derive from locals, we find that there's a fair chunk of NOAANET fiber that has come through here. Port Whitman gave us some additional content, including some of the route content. And then we also take a look at some of the FCC fabric information to determine other possible sources of fiber. Put your mouse over there, you'll see that Pioneer Telephone claims to have fiber there. Not very good performance, and who knows where it's going, but it's allegedly there. So these become what we think of as your main core fiber resources, which we use to assess middle mile potential for other types of solutions within the county where you don't currently have services. So with that base resource in hand, then we can start looking at where are you today in the process of broadband? And that becomes this particular display here, which is showing your critical infrastructure content, your communities. This is a Google Maps map. It has all the same characteristics of any other Google map. So you can change the display and look at things like your terrain, which isn't terribly wonderful in most of the county. And we also have identified various types of funding areas. This, for example, in the black outline those are USDA auction areas that were previously awarded to Viasat, baseline high latency, fully coverable under any of the BEAD or other programs going forward. Viasat just is not going to be a blocker to anything that you're doing. We don't see any RDOF in the area. We don't see any current CAF or ACAM that's going to impact any potential study, any potential projects that go into the county. What we did is, in conjunction with our dear friend Calvin, is we were able to take out areas that either are built or about to be built. And that was mostly along this route here. So these areas we were able to basically define as served or will be served areas. And that was removed from the study. And that's also your population center. And that brought our total household count for the entire county for consideration down to 719. That is basically going to be one of the core issues that we have to deal with as we look into broadband expansion, is that's not a very attractive number for ISPs, but that's what we have to work with. So we can basically take a look at the detail as to where the households are. We'll show you that in a moment. And then we take a look at what would a fixed wireless design look like. We always do a fixed wireless design. And we use a technology model that says you're going to have 100 meg symmetric. And the answer basically is that in your particular scenario, fixed wireless is not going to cover you very well. You have a beautiful set of terrain. You got lots and lots of trees. And no matter where you stick a tower, you're going to find that either your cellular service or your fixed wireless service is just not going to cover that many households. And we'll show you the counts actually in a bit. On this map, we also show pre-existing tower locations for possible co-location use. Those are the blue dots. You can click on them and see who owns them and what their content, connection content is. And you've got a fair chunk of those out there. But again, I would suspect that anybody who drives outside of a main population center here is going to have pretty spotty cell service. And you might get pretty spotty FM radio service in some of these other areas as well. Fixed wireless is not going to be your solution going forward. Simply, your terrain doesn't like you, although I'll bet you get spectacular sunsets. On that, we also took a look at the possibility of, if we were going to put in a fixed wireless solution, what would the fiber routes be? For 7 towers, we'd have to run 72 miles of a backhaul. That's an expensive game in this area. And in terms of trying to get these towers to see each other, we only had 2 potential tower locations that could actually see each other, and the rest were basically isolated. So that kind of discourages us from considering a fixed wireless solution of any kind, which basically drives us into the concept that we got to do fiber. And we got to get as much fiber as we can. If we can't do fixed wireless, that's basically the only choice left. Now, we also took a look at the grant viability of the community. And here's some positive numbers for you as we move forward into the various grant applications that are going to be available. Although in the most recent procurements, the opportunity zones were not classified as high need, 100% of your households are in opportunity zones. Mm-hmm. And that's something that can be leveraged pretty well for grant applications. Another thing is, after we knock out the areas that we know have decent or will have decent services, your average household density is 0.92 per square mile. You are rural. It's not that you say you're rural, but by every possible definition, this is a rural community. And that puts you in a category of a high need, high priority in terms of grant applications. Now, you do not have severely compromised community characteristics. You have nothing tribal, and you don't have any of those SAIPE scores. You have no RDOF blocks. All of your exclusions are Viasat. So none of this is a negative. The opportunity zones and rurality are going to be the key factors that will give you objective scoring, aside from how well you write your own grant. We also took a look at the concept of putting in a phased fiber deployment model. And what that basically does is it takes population centroids and it assigns a 5-year phase program. Phase 1 is year 1, phase 2 is year 2, and so on and so forth. And the costs are approximately the same for each year, assuming there's no inflation from year to year. And this is the number of households that would add it into the fiber were you to work out essentially from the Dayton area outwards. So this would be the year 1 ring, the year 2 ring, 3, 4, and 5. So that's one way you could start thinking about this. Now, there may be much more rational strategies than just doing circles. But what this tells us is it's quite feasible to do a phased approach for deployment from a central region moving outward. And the Dayton area does have a good jump off point for the balance of the county. So we took a look at how the financial models are working out under the various scenarios and take a look at this. Now, this spreadsheet is something that is going to be important for you going forward, especially in terms of grant applications and whatnot. And we saw a couple of things that were kind of both good and bad. First of all, from the fixed wireless percentage, we basically did fixed wireless, and then we started trying to phase in additional fiber until we got as much fiber as we could. And then we looked at the costs. And what was fascinating about this is if we started with fixed wireless, we had to put in something like 72 miles of fiber just to connect the towers. So the costs start off really, really high, no matter what. And then eventually we get to a point where we are getting a fair chunk of fiber into the community, and the incremental costs on that start outweighing the value of having considered fixed wireless at all. And that showed up also in terms of the debt service ratio here, where you see this peaking up here, and then it drops back down. What's happening there is that as long as we have fixed wireless as part of the equation, the actual net cost is bad or worse. So what that kind of drives us into the thought process is, think fiber, don't think fixed wireless. Now, one of the problems, though, is that we start off with the cost per household in the $40,000 range. And that is really, really difficult from a grant application point of view. That's a high cost, a very high cost per household for going down that path. Now, how we came about that is we basically took a look at the installation costs for essentially aerial and underground, and these were provided from some bids that you had in the region previously. They're probably more expensive today than they were at that time, but these would be the driving elements that would drive your costs here. And what we were basically saying, okay, if we did a fixed wireless solution for your 719 households, we could get a whopping, we would leave 569 of those households unserved. We could basically pick up 300 households for about 40 million, or what was it? Something around 30 to $40 million. Not a good fix, not a good fix at all. So as we went down the path of adding more fiber, we started seeing the covered households started dropping like we hoped they would. But even when we got to the attempt to do 100% fiber, we still saw about 12% of your households were so far separated that the cost of getting to them would be in the $200,000 to $300,000 range per household. So what this also tells us is, although we're pushing you towards fiber as much as we can, you are going to have a lot of Starlink customers anyway. Just no practical way to get these costs per household through a reasonable expectation of grant viability. But that's what we're going to recommend you try anyway, is going for as much fiber as you can. And the model that we said to start with is going to cost about $73,000 per household. Now, if you compare that with a typical fiber implementation where everybody's happy, including the people who write the money checks, if you were in the $7,000 per household range, it'd be a no-brainer. You'd have it. If you're under 20, you'd probably get it. And once we get into this range here of $50,000 to $70,000 per household, that becomes very problematic from just a grant perspective. If we take a look at the projected costs on even what we proposed, what we're looking at here is that if the state comes up with, say, $1 billion, you're going to ask for 5% of the state's total allocation to try to cover approximately 700 households. So that makes things very interesting from how to move forward point of view. It's an expensive game. It's not an impossible game. So what we did is we came up with some basic recommendations. And the recommendations basically were pretty straightforward and simple. First of all, what we're thinking is that you should definitely get Starbuck, the community of Starbuck, into this. And you can do the roadway from Starbuck southeast along Tucannon River. Tucannon. And that would be a good middle mile project. Coming back into what that would look like. The probably most effective route would be come out of Zumwalt to Starbuck. It would be cheaper to come off of this run from roughly this Ronan intersection here. But your branch out perspective would be somewhat better. Now, let me bring up a different thing that's not included in your study to illustrate how your population distribution is. I should include this in your study because it doesn't really cost us anything to include it. So what I'm going to be showing you is your household density and why that translates into high cost. So if we come into, where am I, Columbia. All right, and we take a look at your household density in here. What we're seeing is, aside from the route that you already have covered, you've got a couple of routes down here, and then again up along this road where you can pick up some 10s, 20s, 30s of households. But the rest of your distribution down here, these are these ultra high cost solutions down here. These are your Starlink customers into that mountain area. Even if you could get to them, it'd just be too expensive. And you don't have a lot of clustering. You're pretty much randomly distributed once we get off the main highway systems here. So that leads to the concept of why your costs are projected to be so high. You have an occasional cluster of houses, and that's good, but getting to them is expensive. And then getting to some of these outliers is also pretty expensive as well. So in terms of the recommendations, what we're basically saying is get Starbuck first. Because if you can get Starbuck, that's a legitimate middle mile project. And then there's actually you want to try to do is try to put this over a 5-year phase. And although the phase model that we provided isn't necessarily the one that you would want to do, a phasing model would be able to bring you in small but significant clusters of household groupings over a multi-year time frame. It would also reduce the net impact in costs over time. Now, when you're looking at the priorities for the first year of BEAD, one of the criteria basically for the first set of BEAD funding is to basically look at low income and totally unserved high cost areas. Based on the opportunity zone data, that's you. Now, whether or not that gets you to the $40 million mark, I don't think so, but that could certainly get you some significant expansion outside of Dayton and into the Starbuck area. And I think that's what the BAT team should be focusing on. Either that or negotiating with the state for an extraordinary high cost grant. I'm going to pause at this point before I go on to the questions that were posed to me.
So one thing, are you pausing for questions or?
Yes.
Okay, so one thing we had discussed during the first presentation that I'd like to put out there again is we discussed that while Starlink is an option and it's a good, decent rural option, it is expensive. So we did discuss whether or not there could be ways to bring that cost down for people that cannot afford it.
All right, so
yeah.
If we look at the 83 households left over, where we would have a $300,000 connect fee just to get there, And then you ask yourself, how expensive is Starlink compared to that? And what we can start seeing is that as you start getting into the $50,000, $60,000 range per connection per household, and then you figure out the annual Starlink costs, which probably have a projected shelf life of 7 years, it's a lot cheaper to subsidize that. Now, the state basically at this time is officially ambiguous about whether or not it would be able to subsidize satellite, but the state is also extremely aware that satellite is going to be the only possible solution for some counties. Now, that's an issue that will be resolved within your state, hopefully over the next 6 months. It's definitely a discussion topic. It does not have a resolution that I'm aware of at this time.
Yeah, thank you.
Glenn, this is Mark Vasconi from the Washington State Broadband office. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Crashing my demo.
I'm sorry. I'm joining late, but on that point, I was speaking to NTIA's tribal administrator just this past week, in the past couple of days, and it does seem that NTIA is certainly receptive to the idea of Starlink. They're having conversations with Starlink themselves around trying to come up with something that is a lower cost, a lower price point to be included in the program. Because just as a little bit of background, as I think maybe most of us know, in the original notice of funding opportunity that came out a year ago, it looked like Starlink and radio wireless options were somewhat frowned upon, only in except for only in extremely high cost areas. This would clearly count as an extremely high cost area. And in speaking with the NTIA administrator, he indicated that thinking is changing because, they've been doing trips to, rural parts of the country, especially Alaska, where it seems to be well understood within NTIA that they need to do something. If you're going to get internet to all, that's got to have to include a Starlink option. And they're in conversation with Starlink around what can Starlink do to bring price points down for these locations, and potentially some lower income locations that are also deeply rural. I don't have any other confirmation on that, but I know that conversation is progressing.
Let me give you some ammunition. There is, I believe the count is 57 tribal areas in Alaska that are as isolated as this little portion of this county.
Right.
And the solution that is being funded by NTIA consists of a single Starlink terminal and then a small RF repeater that covers the rest of that community. And both NTIA and NTIA is funding it through their tribal program. So in an area like this, which we would otherwise consider inaccessible, if you drop a terminal anywhere in here and put up any number of very, very cheap RF technologies, these households would all of a sudden become served at low cost.
Now, that goes a lot. I mean, boy, talk about Back to the Future. That's stuff that I was doing in Alaska 20 years ago in small villages that were incredibly isolated. And so it's a similar architecture. Bring in satellite connection into the village, and then from the village you've got some sort of fixed wireless or RF technology that gets to the households. Now, the administrator also told me, he said, we're looking at that, understanding that you might not get 100/20 utilizing this, but having something is much better than having nothing. And so I think they're looking at that and are probably going to be willing. I would think from that conversation, and we'll see what happens. I have to caveat that, but going forward, I think there's probably a pretty decent piece of advocacy and argument for utilizing that kind of architecture, combining satellite and fixed wireless, or satellite and some local RF connectivity. So it's worth thinking about. It's currently certainly worth it.
But from the BAT team perspective, I would consider that as a very serious lobbying position to take.
I have two thoughts along those lines. We have the opportunity, of course, to do a remote star architecture of some sort, where you have a satellite drop that is now much lower latency than it used to be with the advent of services like Starlink. Is there any reason to specifically discourage a local fiber network in that situation? Why would you choose to go RF over fiber for the local distribution?
The cost per mile.
Okay.
Basically, I can put a credible, an area like we're looking at right now. I could take a Mimosa Omni antenna off Amazon for $800, put it on somebody's rooftop, and I could deliver probably 25 symmetric to every household in the field of view. It's a crappy solution, but it would work. Now, if I wanted to get more sophisticated, I could use licensed spectrum, CBRS, and all that sort of stuff, and pay myself $35,000 to do the same thing. But you don't need high sophistication for small coverage areas. I mean, these things are line of sight, visual, rooftop to rooftop.
That makes sense.
Between each other. If you drop fiber in there,
metric opens up video calling, which is a big deal for remote education, remote work.
Yeah, and Starlink will probably give you credibly in this part of the country a good 100 meg, and if you buy the commercial services, maybe 250. I'm not sure what the Alaska Connect project was buying, but I know it was not residential grade.
And then the second thought along those lines is, given the timelines that we're talking about, in the 5-year range, is there any discussion about the viability of Kuiper, which is Amazon's flavor of the same?
As soon as start launching and testing, then we can talk about viability.
As soon as they're not vaporware, got it.
Okay, Connie, I think Connie had her hand up. Are you still there, Connie?
I am. Thank you, Jeannie. I was just trying to tag on what Mark Vesconi had said. Is I was in Washington, D.C. last month, and I had met with Douglas Kinkoff, or I had brought up the situation about Columbia County and talking about Starlink, and he the message was similar to what Mark had the conversation this week with the NTI tribal, is that he was applauding Starlink because they've done leaps and bounds of trying to improve, and they just did a demo to NTI like earlier last month, and so I just wanted to provide confirmation.
Okay, and I have one other, thank you, Connie. I have one other comment to Glenn about fiber versus wireless in a small cluster of homes. One of our local ISPs, Columbia iConnect, has a kind of a local wireless system in Starbuck, and has a huge issue with reaching the homes because of line of sight. The line of sight is a barrier. So because of trees and other things. So they actually were a proponent of fiber as the last connection, even if it's a wireless system. So I just thought I'd mention that. Another one of our wonderful county attributes.
You can do a terrain analysis and a ground clutter analysis fairly easily to figure out if fiber really is your best choice. You can get a good handle where you start seeing green. That's either farm, in which case you don't care, or it's trees, in which case you do care.
Yes.
And then you drop on the terrain modeling. I mean, this is just freebie stuff here. And you start seeing that, I've got a valley I can play with, but I'm not going to get from this point here to this point here without going through these hills. So in an area like this, I could pick up that cluster here. I might be able to relay down to here. And from here, I could pick up a smaller cluster. And maybe over here, I could pick up another cluster. But this could be a good case for just run some fiber.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other aspect is you don't have to run commercial grade fiber. If this is a private community type situation, you can literally, and this is a little bit weird, but you can run the cable on the ground in PVC pipe for about $3,000 a mile. And so it's sort of protected from the squirrels. It's not a professional grade installation. It's done in Maine, of all weird places. And it's sort of like a poor man's fiber connection, but it's something that local citizens can actually afford to do. Now, any professional engineer will tell you that's a hooey way to do it, but it's cheap and it works.
Okay. Any other questions before he moves on? All right, go ahead, Glenn.
All right, I'm going to deal with the questions you sent to me in email. All right, so your first question was, how does 5G affect your planning? And in your case, well, of course, there's different kinds of 5G. So for example, I have 5G on my cell phone. What that basically is that's LTE better. So if you had, for example, good T-Mobile coverage or good Verizon coverage with LTE 4G, then you have slightly better with LTE 5G. But the 5G hype is primarily focused on the concept of can I get fiber speeds, gigahertz speeds, and that's a different kettle of fish. That's a high frequency 5G, typically in the 40 gigahertz range. If you are in a dense urban area, 5G makes a lot of sense. It's cheaper than running fiber and ripping up the streets and the sewers to get the fiber in the ground. It's got a range of maybe, on a good day, half a mile. And if it doesn't rain, you got a good signal. You start talking about rural areas like where you are, and the only places where it would work would be in Dayton, where you don't need it, and Starbuck, where you've got too many trees. So 5G is not really going to be a solution for this community.
Okay, then that matches what I've heard in the past, but you know, the public often thinks that's going to be the answer. So part of our messaging needs to be letting them know that that's not going to be the answer.
When you go into community education materials, you will find a pocket guide to 5G hype.
Nice. Okay.
All right. Can you provide more information on potential new satellite providers that may give Starlink some competition? I think we touched on that. The issue isn't so much the technology as it is the launch technology. And Starlink has SpaceX. SpaceX has the lowest cost launch technology available. The Amazon and other types of solutions are technically fine, except they're not up there. If they can get up there, they have to do it affordably, and that have to pass that affordability cost on to you. I would say it's easily 3 to 5 years before you could have an alternative to Starlink, but almost certainly in 10 years, you'll have lots of alternatives. It's just too much money to be made out there to be ignored. And Starlink, the more monopolistic it gets, the more others are going to want to break into that monopoly. But it's not your short-term solution other than Starlink. And I hate to say that to a sole source vendor, but it's a pretty powerful source. Can you provide some demonstrations for us in the spreadsheet on options? Well, not that you have lots of options, but let me talk a little bit about your fiber installation costs, which would have a pretty powerful impact on you. Now, these numbers came out of some of the recent quotes that were occurring within your county. And these, I think, were primarily bids that occurred in Dayton area.
Yes.
One of the things that struck me is that your trenched fiber costs are extremely high, and the percentage of fiber is extremely high. If you could do everything aerial and pretend forest fires never happen, then your cost structures are going to change dramatically. Your project costs now come down in the 16 to 25, $26 million range. That now means that you're extremely high cost, but you're much more affordable high cost. Now that's a discussion you would have to have with the ISP and construction companies. Can you do aerial only? And that's one of the options that you had of in looking at the spreadsheet as to what the impacts are of that. Now, another thing that we looked at was that your base installation costs we saw were pretty good, but we've anticipated a high make ready rate. Well, high from one point of view of about 10%. I don't know your pole quality out there. If you can, maybe Nick does. I just saw that hand go up. But if you can avoid that make ready rate, that can drop your costs as well. Nick, you're on.
Yeah, I actually wanted to go back to your previous comment about forest fires. It is, and Mark, I meant to bring this up yesterday because who's our friend over in Garfield County, Calvin? I can't remember her name.
Diana
is scared to death about forest fires and how it's going to impact the network there. And I heard something similar from Marianne yesterday. And as a float, a state-backed insurance fund of some kind, or just a understanding of how we could shore up networks against emergency situations, I think would be a great thing. And that'll be represented in the WSU report. So I just wanted to throw that in there. Mark, I don't know if you had thought about that in any way whatsoever, but yeah.
It's a good idea. I have not thought about that kind of sort of states. I mean, if I understand what you're saying, it's like a state-sponsored insurance.
Yeah, and honestly, maybe federal emergency dollars
maybe
would
FEMA
actually
dollars.
come into play. Yeah.
What I don't know anything about how FEMA looks at stuff. Do they only come in after the fact? I mean, I know that, flood insurance and that sort of thing is underwritten, I believe, by FEMA, but I don't know. That's something that that's new to me. I'm sorry. I can't say anything more, but yeah.
And I mean, it came up. I was like, and I don't know what the answer is there, but I mean, the state, nationally, we do back real property like that in certain cases.
Right.
So anyway, something to consider and think about.
Well, and Nick and Mark, this is one of the topics that needs to be covered in our 5-year action plan. Is we're supposed to be building for resiliency, and that was an issue as well that was discussed last month at NTIA is for fires, and so trying to take that all in consideration as to what's being built.
Anyway, I just wanted to call that out and throw that just be like, here is a thought, just because we have a very unique group of people on this meeting right at this moment.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome, really.
Yeah.
Thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, no, thank you.
All right, now back to other things you can do with the spreadsheet. Now, one of the things that I would pay attention to is the ISP's 5-year internal rate of return. Now, the issue that you have to focus on, if you're looking at less than one household per square mile, the cost of doing what's called a truck roll, getting the truck from the barn to the problem in your community is basically going to translate to maybe 1 truck roll per day. So if you have 2 problems, that's 2 trucks, 2 people, 1 day. Or you have the alternative where they say, I guarantee you service this week, which of course generates a tremendous amount of customer satisfaction. but that may be the situation you're in there. Now, one way you can offset that, and you're going to hate this answer, is that you raise your subscription fees up to about $100 a month. Now you're getting close to Starlink territory. And now you're getting close to where the ISP wants to be. They really want that number to be 120%. We're at $93 right now. If we raise that to $100 even, we're really, really close. Now, people hate paying high costs for services, but if you did have a fiber service within the community, in spite of the fact that you're 100% opportunity zone, the question you have to assess is it of sufficient value to pay a high price subscription fee to get those services at all? Now, right now, we got you factored in at a 45% subscription rate. What we'd really want to do is see something like 60%. All of a sudden, your numbers are golden. You're paying $100 per month. You got 60% subscribers. All the financials work out in favor of the ISP. But at $100 a month, can you get to 60%? Probably not. And that's one of the fine balancing points that we can work out in terms of what's called a what-if calculator in the spreadsheet, trying to get that number at 120% versus, say, subscription rate or a subscription fee. And if we go into an in-depth discussion, I'll show you exactly how to set up that modeling to figure out what that is. And then that points back to, as the BAT team, can you get your community to commit to these levels of subscription and subscription fees to keep an ISP that's going to be putting fiber in the ground interested? Because they know their maintenance costs are going to be extremely high. And they're going to want to see some serious performance from the community.
Glenn, I think that you're headed this direction very quickly, but could we actually model what happens when we bring in some grants, seeing as how Columbia County is going to get some sort of section of $1.2 billion?
Yeah, how much of a
million to 1.2?
Yeah, so let's say we turn this into, say, 5% debt, 95% grant. Okay, now that's not going to affect the ISP. The ISP isn't impacted by that unless they're writing the check. And in that particular case, for this model, they're writing a check for $1.4 million. Now, the state has guidelines, I think, that say at the moment that's going to have to be something like 20%. It doesn't matter what the number is. The fact is you can change it to match that number. And that comes in just about okay. If you say you need a 20% subsidy for Columbia County, well, you can probably service the debt. You'd probably be happier at 19%, if I can type the numbers here correctly. But yeah, we can do that, Nick, and the spreadsheet permits you to play that game.
Just the 20%. There's a 25% match requirement through NTIA, and there is money that has been appropriated by the legislature that will, over the course of, I think, 3 biennia, be a total of about 200 million. So that, I guess where I'm, yeah, there you go, 25%. But that's not debt that the county has to incur. That would be a 25% grant from the state for the match. Okay, you're just, so debt is really match, is that right, Glenn?
Well, in the model, it's debt, but in your context, that debt is zeroed out.
Yeah, so it'd be 100% grant. Right, Mark?
Basically, that's
Yeah.
right. That's right.
But what it also tells you is that with this model, if this is the model you choose, you need $7 million from the state as the 25% match.
Which is, okay, that's like, I mean, just in terms of round numbers, that's like 3.5% of the total $200 million allotment.
All right, bad team, you got to keep this guy on your side.
He is on our side, I swear.
Yes. Yes,
All
I
right.
mean, yeah, I wish we could have more match money come from the state, you know.
All right. Anyway, if we want to go through this spreadsheet, I recommend a separate session for people who want to dive deep. And obviously that's Nick and anybody else who wants to be interested.
Yeah,
All right,
that sounds good. Thank you.
Creative solutions being used in other counties like ours with an undulating topography. Yeah, you're not going to like it. One of the solutions that we found in Kentucky was to go to extremely low frequency cellular in roughly the 200 to 400 megahertz range. And what that does is it gets through trees and it gets over some hills and you get a net throughput at maybe 5 megabits. So that would be a creative solution. I don't know if you can even buy that technology anymore. That's like 1G class stuff, but it's one option you could think about. At the high end, there's
Didn't they relicense that?
I don't know where it ended up.
I think that got relicensed to digital. I can't remember. Sorry, but I thought it got relicensed.
Well, not all of Kentucky got it relicensed. We're one cellular company down there that has low frequency stuff, specifically because of their terrain is as bad as yours. Another option is there's what are called mesh networks. There's a couple of companies that build mesh networks, and these are basically small relay stations that talk to each other. And you can basically place them every mile or two, going down a road and place a fiber. They're cheaper to install than fiber. You have to have solar backup and battery and a fence so that the vandals don't take it home with them. And they'll deliver a broadband-like service at the endpoints. The problem with any mesh technology is that every time you have a point-to-point link forward, you lose some bandwidth. So you may start out with a gig at one end and you may end up with 10 meg at the other end. It's cheaper than fiber, but it's not going to give you anywhere close to fiber performance if you have more than a few hops. And beyond that, I'm kind of out of brilliant ideas as to what terrains you have that are comparable. I would say Kentucky, because we've done like 30 studies in Kentucky and we've only found one that had decent terrain. We're seeing the similar thing in Washington State. You get different trees. Your trees are taller.
So my Port Commission chair, Seth Bryan, is on the call today, and he had mentioned to me that he used to live in Kentucky, and he thought there was a fiber to the home project in a really rural segment of Kentucky. So I don't know if you know anything about that.
All right, so this comes back to what's the definition of rural. If we use the USDA definition, I think it's anything below 6 households per square mile equals rural. Most of Kentucky is higher density than that. But if you live in a rural community, you know it. Your friends have chickens, you have chickens. There's a cow down the road. That's rural. Now, if we look at your county, your average household density is less than 1 per square mile. And you can all have your own chickens and cows too. The difference is the separation between the households where you are is much higher than a lot of the places we've looked at in Kentucky. In Kentucky, by the USDA definition of the 30 studies we've done there, none of them came close to being classified by the USDA as rural. Although the people living there believe they're rural. I think I live in a rural community, but by the USDA definition, I don't. My nearest neighbor is less than half a mile away.
Okay.
Other questions? All right, so what I would recommend for the BAT team is find yourself your best spreadsheet gurus, and let's set up another session where we're going to go through the spreadsheet in such painful detail that you won't need me for the spreadsheet ever again. And then I can probably put you in touch with the guy who managed the Alaska Starlink project and get his input as to how he talked the NTIA into doing something that neither SpaceX or the NTIA thought they were going to do. And that might help you from a lobbying and political point of view.
Okay.
His name is Jim Berlin, and I'll get you his other contact information after this meeting.
Okay. So who wants to join in a spreadsheet meeting? Nick?
It's almost as good as the slumber party. You'll love it.
So I'm looking for,
If we can, if the schedules align, I'm familiar with how to manipulate Excel. I
oh,
don't
well, so am
necessarily know
I.
the numbers
Yeah.
involved, but
Yeah, I can't do. It's more about the content for me, but yeah, okay. All right. So we got Nick holding up his hand up. Anybody else? Calvin, are you not ready yet? Oh, good, Calvin. Okay.
Do you have
Scott,
any
I-
grant
I
writers in
saw-
the room?
Scott, I saw that little hint of interest.
It's there. It's just we're getting ready to like stage up for harvest, getting ready for harvest. I have so much rollout I have to do that I don't think I have the bandwidth to do it, but I really
Yeah.
would like to get into it.
Well, how about if we
Well-
invite you and you can
Yeah.
decide at the time? Okay.
Yeah.
I was
let's
gonna
do
say, for me, if we can dive in and go as deep as we can and record it, that would be super useful
You bet,
because
you bet.
I've got to do this or I've got, 19 other counties that are doing the same thing. So Glenn, I like you, man, but I really don't want to spend that much time with you going through the spreadsheet again and again and again.
All right, Nick, that's okay. I'm seeing too much of you and Jason these days anyway.
We're seeing
Me
too
on
much
the
of each
same
other.
list. Put me on the same list, Jenny, with Scott. Put me on the invite. I can't promise that I'll have the bandwidth when the time comes, but I'd
Okay.
like.
Excellent. Thanks, Marty. Okay. And then anyone else offline, if you decide you're interested, let me know. I took in a lot more information this time around. Hearing it a second time was good. So thank you so much, Glenn, and everyone for agreeing to do that again. So I'll set that up offline. I'll find a way to, what we do with our recordings is we post them, we just host them on YouTube. So I'll make sure that we get this up and have a link to it from our website, and that I'll send the link out to the BAT. And we'll go from there. Finish up our plan, I guess. Glenn, I heard you ask if there were any grant writers in the room. That would be me.
Okay.
I don't know if there's anyone else here that, I think Tina's probably a grant writer, but I don't know if this wants to be her area, but
Well,
anyone
what I
else
would
is
recommend
welcome.
is painful though it may be, I'd recommend you be on the spreadsheet training. Point out the items that you want to copy and paste.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions or comments?
Jenny, you can work with me to get this scheduled. We'll figure out the timing.
Oh, okay. Work with
Everybody.
Nancy. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nancy. I know that Glenn and everyone's time is in very high demand right now. Okay, well, thank you everybody very much. And if you want to look at this study yourself and you do not have the link or the login, I'm happy to give it to you. Just let me know. It's information for all of us to use. All right. Thank you. See you next time.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks to everyone from the state, Mr. Visconti.
Yes.
Connie
And
Rivera.
Connie and everyone for attending.
Yeah,
Yes. Thank
really
you.
good discussion. Thanks.
Thanks. And I want to give a shout out to Glenn. Thank you. The clarity of this is really helpful. And to Jenny's point, you have to see it a couple times. And when you start working with the spreadsheets, things start to surface, questions start to surface. And that's really important to wrap your heads around that. I mean, modeling takes time and it takes engagement. And so, but thank you all. And again, Glenn, Nick. Thanks.
Yeah, the clarity on how matches is gonna work, because that's one of those things coming down that is not super clear.
No, I mean, we're at the front end of this. So, I wish I had all the answers. I wish I had more answers for all of this, but it's going to take this kind of back and forth iteration in order to get to things that are going to work. But, there is going to be match money out there. It's going to be stretched out over a period of time. We wish it had all come in one big chunk, but that's not what happened. But there is money out there expressly for the purpose of supporting the 25% match requirement. So that is there. And that's what it's going to take. It's going to take a lot of different threads of funding, whether it's state match, whether it's BEAD money, possibly RUS money, Rural Connect stuff. I mean, it's going to take a bunch to thread together. So I'm glad that money's out there. But that match money, I mean, it lowers debt cost at the front end, which is really helpful as you start to engage in the modeling process. So that's helpful.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right. I'm stopping the recording.